I'm Adam. This is a story of a girl who began life amid sugar and sun, and whose name slips through the usual maps of history. Amy Dubuc de Rivery was born in Martinique in 1768, raised among plantation houses and ledger lives, sent to a convent in France to learn the ways of class and piety, then put aboard a ship for home in the summer of 1788. The ship never arrived. No wreck, no survivors, no clear answer. Some accounts point at Barbary corsairs, others at storm or mischance. A more startling claim grew over decades, that Amy was taken, carried across empires, and installed in the Ottoman court under a new name, Naxidil, later mother to a sultan. It is a story that asks us to choose between wonder and evidence. In the next minutes, I will bring you the documents that remain, the rumors that multiplied, and the exact moments where history hands us proof and where it refuses to speak. Decide for yourself which is more persuasive, the archive or the story people wanted to believe. Amy grew up where heat made the day feel continuous, where sugarcane fields moved like a slow green sea, and where the world's profits were counted in the numbers of human labor. Her family lived in a house of white shutters and wide verandas, a house that smelled of molasses and lime oil. She learned early the manners of rank, the correct bow, the quiet voice in front of elders, the careful way to accept both compliments and the small cruelties that preserved order on an island built by force. Those details matter. They make her more than a name lost at sea. They make her someone who had a life interrupted, not erased. At about 10 years old, she was sent across the ocean to a convent school in France. The convent was an entirely different climate, both literally and socially. In the convent, she met a disciplined silence, a curriculum of needlework, Latin prayer, and measured conversation. She read texts that shaped European ideas about virtue, duty, and family. She learned French manners polished for court, habits that would mark her later as unmistakably European. Boarding schools like that were common for planter families who wanted their daughters to carry the right accent and the right connections. The journey to Europe was expensive and risky, but it was a bet on social capital. For Amy, it was a bridge between a Caribbean childhood and a metropolitan adulthood that never fully arrived. In the summer of 1788, she left France to return. The voyage should have been familiar. Crossing the Atlantic was a known hardship of travel. But that particular crossing became a loss that no document has fully explained. Ships in that era disappeared for many reasons. Storms could wipe out sails and masts, leaving no wreckage for coastal surveyors to find. Navigation was an art and not yet exact science. Conflicts at sea happened with alarming suddenness. Men who sailed knew the ocean had moods that could swallow entire vessels. The more formal records, customs lists, port entries, family letters, recorded departures, and never recorded an arrival. For Amy's relatives, the absence was a hole that policy and prayer could not stitch closed. Stories about what happened multiplied quickly because absence invites a story. One strand of those stories crossed the Mediterranean and the coffers of North African ports. Their corsair captains took prizes, human and material, and used them within a complex economy of ransom and diplomacy. Captives might be enslaved, ransomed, integrated into households, or offered as political gifts. The notion that a young Frenchwoman could end up far from home, shifted into another social world, felt plausible to many observers at the time. That plausibility fed rumors that crossed borders and languages, each retelling adding confidence where evidence was thin. Scholars who later examined the case looked in places people rarely did: palace registers, funeral lists, legal transfers, and estate documents. Those records show a woman called Naxidil within the Ottoman imperial circle, a woman who attained influence and whose son, Mahmud II, would play a major role in Ottoman reform. Those facts are solid. Where the record breaks down is in the bridge between Amy's disappearance and Naxidil's presence in Istanbul. Different archives offer different origin stories for Naxidil, many pointing to the Caucasus rather than the Caribbean. That does not make the tales about a Martinique heiress impossible, but it shifts the burden of proof. A compelling narrative does not equal documentation. There's another layer here: how stories are used. For readers in Europe, a tale of a planter's daughter becoming a sultan's mother made the Ottoman world feel less foreign and more entwined with Europe. For Ottoman chroniclers and later historians, The story offered a way to explain unfamiliar customs by tying them to European practices. In both directions, the myth served cultural needs, to explain, to connect, to assert influence. That is why historians treat such stories carefully. We separate what documents support from what collective imagination supplies. Amy's life, as far as we can trace it, sits at the intersection of two larger histories. The Caribbean plantation system that produced enormous wealth at terrible human cost, and the long, trans-regional networks of Mediterranean and Black Sea enslavement and diplomacy. Each system shaped people's lives beyond simple narratives of tragedy or triumph. Amy's disappearance touches both systems, and how we tell that story reveals more about our desire to make sense than about the certainty of the facts. The thread linking an Atlantic disappearance to an Ottoman court is thin, and historians follow it with patience and skepticism. Ottoman palace registers and later chronicles record a woman named Naxidil who rose to prominence inside the imperial household. She appears in lists of concubines, in birth records, in funerary notes. Those administrative traces are tangible. They place a real person at the heart of Istanbul's power. The question is how, or whether, that person connects to a missing girl from Martinique. Naxidil's life in the records shows features typical of women who entered the palace from outside the empire. She took a new name, joined a new faith, learned courtly codes, and through motherhood acquired influence. The palace reconfigured identities through ritual and law. A European origin was possible, but not the most common route in the late 18th century. Many women enter from the Caucasus or Black Sea regions, places that regularly supplied girls into imperial households. To link Amy's disappearance to palace records requires a chain of small proofs, matching dates, surviving correspondences, foreign reports of a capture and transfer. The evidence is often fragmentary. A single letter, a traveler's note, a later pamphlet. Where fragments form a coherent chain, scholars grow confident. Where gaps remain, caution is the honest stance. For Amy and Naxidil, the gaps are large. Researchers such as Nekdet Sakaglu argue strongly for a Caucasian origin for Naxidil. That argument does not close the question entirely, but it makes the Caribbean theory harder to sustain without new documents. Istanbul presented a world of rituals foreign to a Caribbean childhood. Tile courtyards, ritual baths, and a strict choreography of palace life. Women there navigated alliances and patronage with political skill that often outstripped visible male power. If a planter's daughter reached that world, she would have had to adapt quickly. Her survival would depend on learning languages, customs, and the subtle rules of favor. Even without a Caribbean claimant, the palace environment shows how a woman could transform status, gain influence, and shape events through quieter means and battlefield glory. The alternative is often harsher. Amy may have drowned or been lost in some unrecorded catastrophe. This possibility reminds us that not every absence hides a secret, and not every gap in archives should be filled with invention. Many lives disappear without leaving a trail. Many families live with an ache that neither rumor nor scholarly correction can heal. There's a kind of honesty in accepting loss without dressing it as elaborate destiny. Why does the Amy, Naxidil story keep returning? Because it promises mobility across worlds, a violent rupture followed by dramatic reintegration. It satisfies a desire for transformation and for hidden links between distant societies. It also taps a European tendency to explain the unfamiliar by folding it into known patterns. Those cultural needs made the tale resilient across decades and languages, feeding newspapers, travelers' tales, and later popular histories. For historians, the job is twofold. First, listen to these tales as cultural objects that reveal what people wanted to believe. Second, test the tale's factual backbone against records. That dual method is not optional. It is essential. The sensibilities that created the Amy legend tell us about European hopes and anxieties as much as Ottoman life, and archival findings that complicate the legend do not erase its emotional pull. They only require clearer boundaries between evidence and invention. For storytellers, there is a simple rule. Give the audience the drama and the facts. Offer vivid scenes, suspenseful beats, and human stakes. Then make transparent where documents stop. Show the smells of the quay, the weight of a trunk, the silence of family home after departure. Then present the registers and the letters that survive. That balance keeps the story moving while respecting history. Her son Mahmud, too, later led reforms, and Naxidil's presumed influence give the tale extra consequence. Whether Caribbean or Caucasian, her presence in court memory ties a private life to public change, reminding us that where someone comes from often shapes how their story is remembered today. Rumor is a kind of map, and maps often tells more about the map makers and the land they claim to show. Throughout the 19th century, newspapers and travel accounts offered a single, tidy meaning. A European girl vanished and reappeared at the center of an empire. That version comforts readers. It simplifies complexity into a dramatic arc. It also hides the everyday mechanics of power and commerce that shape both the Caribbean and the Ottoman world. Historians gather fragments, ledgers, baptismal certificates, diplomatic notes, and burial lists, and test how they fit without forcing a pleasing story. In Amy's case, the firmest traces sit in Martinique family records and Ottoman entries that name a woman called Naxidil. The space between those traces contains gaps. Into those gaps, rumor and imagination spilled. At times, the bridges scholars build rest on documents. At times, they rest on slim conjecture. Caution is the proper stance. Archives themselves are partial witnesses. They were produced by institutions with limited aims. Plantations recorded yields and human counts. Churches logged baptisms. Palaces kept lists of attendance. These records preserve some details and ignore others. A ledger records slave numbers with cold accuracy. It rarely notes a girl's private thoughts. An imperial register will list a concubine by name, but not the pathway that brought her there. The archive is necessary and incomplete. Oral transmission adds further complications. Stories told by travelers, salon guests, and sailors acquired new trimmings with each retelling. Embellishment is not always deceit. It is part of communal memory. The Amy legend circulated where readers crave reversal and romance. That made the tale resilient. Even when documentary support faltered, readers across continents preferred a narrative that connected distant lands through fate and fortune. We should also weigh the politics of identity in that era. Claiming a French origin for a powerful palace woman was a way of domesticating difference, of making Ottoman power legible to European sensibilities. It is a familiar tactic in imperial narratives. Explain the foreign by folding it into the familiar. Such moves ease anxiety about difference, but they distort historical realities. Those distortions have costs. When a single romantic account eclipses larger systems, like the Black Sea slave trade, the diplomacy of ransom, or colonial labor regimes, we lose sight of scale. A gripping anecdote can overshadow the structures that shape millions of lives. Responsible storytelling resists letting narrative eclipse context. It gives the audience suspense and character while pointing to systemic forces. For consumers of history, there is a practical lesson. Balance curiosity with skepticism. Ask what the archives actually show and which claims rely on rumor. Notice who benefits from a version of events. Take care to recover voices pushed to the margins, enslaved workers, sailors, and unnamed servants, whose labor underpinned dramatic moments, but who rarely appear in triumphant narratives. Amy's disappearance ends not with tidy closure, but with questions that invite further work. That openness is not a failing. It is a direction. It asks historians to search new repositories, to translate neglected documents, and to listen to oral traditions with critical care. For a channel like History World, the space between evidence and story is a strength. We can tell a moving narrative and teach viewers how to read records, weigh rumors, and honor both the person and the myth without letting one erase the other. That approach demands humility from storytellers and viewers alike. We can dramatize scenes, the scent of salt and sugar, the hush of a convent, the hush of a palace corridor, while clearly marking where evidence ends. We can invite the audience to question, to research, and to remember that historical truth often arrives in fragments. If History World insists on that blended method, each episode becomes both a gripping account and a guide to critical reading. Amy's vanishing remains an open question that calls historians and curious viewers to seek answers together. Years after the disappearance, the story of a vanished girl folded into debates about empire, identity, and power. For some readers, a claim that a French planter's daughter became a figure at the heart of Ottoman rule offered a comforting continuity. For others, a tale masked painful realities. making a single life stand for complicated systems of trafficking, labor, and diplomacy. The legend's afterlife shaped how people imagined both Martinique and Istanbul, and those imaginings affected public opinion, policy, and the kinds of questions historians pursued. If we watch how the story moved through newspapers, memoirs, and pamphlets, we see a pattern. The account simplified. It presented the extraordinary as readable and reduced unfamiliar worlds into familiar categories. A European face in an Ottoman court made the foreign legible and less threatening. In salons and coffee houses, readers debated whether French manners might have seeped into palace life, whether European education could explain certain tastes or reforms. Those conversations reveal more about the audiences who consumed the story than about the person at its center. Cultural consequences mattered. Writers used the tale to argue political points about civilization and the reach of European influence, and sometimes as evidence of moral decline or moral superiority. Travelers' tales and guidebooks repeated the story until it became an accepted anecdote. Yet historians who went back to archives found that the chain of custody for the claim was weak. That mismatch between popular belief and documentary support shows why care is necessary when turning rumor into accepted fact. It also reveals that narrative desire often outpaced the slow, patient work of paperwork and verification. There is also a human cost when legend replaces lived experience. Enslaved men, women, and children who labored on plantations left fewer personal records. Their lives are often reconstructed through ledgers, bills of sale, and colonial reports. When audiences fixate on a dramatic anecdote, the systemic brutality behind wealth production risks being ignored. History that elevates spectacle over structure can entertain while leaving viewers less informed about the processes that shape millions of lives. Academic work has tried to correct that imbalance. Scholars have pushed beyond printed rumor, searching ecclesiastical registers, estate inventories, shipping manifests, and court papers. They have read burial lists and translated foreign dispatches, hoping to find a connective tissue between an Atlantic departure and an Ottoman presence. At the same time, historians treat popular accounts as cultural objects worth studying for what they reveal about reception and meaning. Both kinds of inquiry matter. Archival rigor clarifies what can be known, while cultural history explains why certain stories persisted. For storytellers, there is a clear responsibility. The Vanished Girl narrative gives us compelling contrasts. The heat of cane fields and the cool shade of palace courtyards, the hush of a convent and the ritual of court life. Those contrasts make for vivid scenes. We can dramatize them while making explicit where evidence ends and speculation begins. That transparency deepens trust with an audience. It invites viewers into methods, show them the documents, the gaps, the places we must pause. Doing so turns passive consumption into active curiosity. At the level of public memory, the Amy legend is instructive. It tests whether we privilege novelty over truth, and whether we prefer tidy connections to messy realities. It shows how stories cross languages and borders, shifting meaning with each retelling. For a history world, that lesson is valuable. The episode offers both a gripping narrative and an opportunity to model responsible storytelling, deliver drama, present evidence, and mark the limits of what can be known. Finally, there is an ethical dimension that should guide us. When we dramatize lives lost on certain records, we should remember the people behind the names. Whether Amy became Naxodil, or whether she vanished into the sea, the consequence for those who loved her was real. Grief has weight regardless of later myths. When we tell the story now, centuries later, we can restore dignity by acknowledging both human loss and the limits of our knowledge. Compassion and rigor together make the strongest history, one that honors lives without mistaking legend for fact. This episode must end with both an image and a lesson. The image is a single human life displaced across oceans and courts, a name that moves from a plantation ledger to rumor-laced columns in newspapers and into the cold entries of an imperial register. The lesson is methodological. Stories are powerful, but historians must separate the inviting outline of a narrative from what documents can actually show. That separation is not a refusal to tell a moving story. This is required. Start with rhythm. After a dramatic hook, alternate short, arresting sentences with longer explanatory passages. Use questions that invite the listener to think, then answer them with clear evidence. For example, narrate the moment of disappearance in Tight, Sensory phrases. The slap of rigging, the salt smell of air, the weight of a small trunk. Then pause and present the archival fact. A port departure recorded, no arrival logged. That pattern maintains suspense while grounding the audience in verifiable detail. Balance human detail with structural context. Episodes that focus only on anecdote risk turning systemic injustice into a single remarkable incident. Amy's story gains force when placed beside the labor system that created her family's wealth and the maritime systems that made sea travel perilous. Explain how plantations administer human lives, how shipping networks move people and goods, and how Mediterranean politics made captivity and ransom part of international relations. Those larger frames deepen meaning, without draining drama. If History World adopts these practices consistently, the channel will not only tell gripping stories, but will model how to read the past. Compelling narrative and archival honesty are not opposites. They can be combined to produce episodes that are both emotionally satisfying and intellectually rigorous. History still demands careful imagination still. If this story teaches anything, it is how history arrives in fragments, and how those fragments gain weight from the questions we bring to them. Naxodil, as a name in palace lists, sits beside a son who would rule and try to reshape an empire. Amy, as a name in Martinique records, sits beside ledgers that count profit and human loss. Between those two names, there is an ache that invites narrative and a duty that demands careful evidence. Both impulses matter, but they must be kept in balance. Consider Mahmud II for a moment. He presided over reforms that changed military structures, administration, and the shape of Ottoman power in the early 19th century. When storytellers link those reforms back to a mother with a foreign upbringing, the tale becomes tempting. A private biography explaining public change. It is a neat story, and neat stories travel fast. Yet neatness can disguise uncertainty. The responsible narrator points to correlation without collapsing it into causation. If Naxodil influenced court tastes or a private conversation, that would be one kind of historical trace. If she shaped policy, that would demand documents and testimony that we do not always possess. The difference matters. There is another lesson in the silence. Silence does not always mean absence of action. Sometimes it marks the limits of what was recorded. Plantation records register crops and enslave people with clinical detail, but they rarely captured grief, friendship, or the small resistances that made daily life bearable. Ottoman registers recorded names and dates, but rarely described the private council behind a palace door. Listening to silence requires imagination tempered by restraint. Imagine textures, scents, and gestures, but do not declare them facts. For a channel like History World, this episode is a model. We can create scenes, salt on a young woman's lips as a ship pitches, the muffled clang of a convent bell, sunlight on a tiled courtyard, without converting imagined sensations into supposed evidence. We dramatize possibilities and then show the documents that support or contradict them. That method turns entertainment into education and curiosity into critical thinking. If the notion that one missing person could be woven into imperial memory grab you, give this video a thumbs up now. If you ever had a family mystery, an ancestor who left and never returned, share one line about them in the comments. Your story matters. Engage. Which explanation feels most likely to you? Storm, pirates, or capture followed by transfer? Vote in the poll pinned to this video and explain why in the comments. Ask. If you want more episodes that pair dramatic narrative with archival evidence, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next inquiry. Send this episode to a friend who loves mysteries that double as history. It helps the channel and spreads careful storytelling. Add this video to a playlist of historical mysteries to revisit when you want to weigh evidence with others. As we close this section, think about the ethics of telling such stories. When narratives involve people who are vulnerable, enslaved, displaced, or silenced, our obligation grows. We owe accuracy and we owe compassion. Facts should guide our imagination, not be an afterthought to a more enjoyable plot. Finally, consider this an invitation rather than a verdict. The Amy Naxodil question remains open enough to warrant more archival work, more translations, and more public curiosity. If you're a reader, a researcher, or someone with family documents tucked away, tell us what you find. History World will follow promising leads, present the evidence, and leave space for viewers to decide what feels true. We will examine a related maritime disappearance from the same century and show how shipping manifests and insurance records can either confirm a rumor or expose it as wishful thinking. If that sounds like your kind of story, subscribe and come back for the documents. This story ends where many historical mysteries must end, with evidence and emotion side by side, neither pretending to be the other. Amy du Buc de Rivery's name appears in parish books and family records in Martinique. Naxodil's name appears in palace lists and Ottoman notes. Between those entries lie seas of silence and pages that do not survive. That space is not a failing of history. It is its condition. Good inquiry treats absence as data. It notes what is missing, asks why, and uses that absence to direct further work. Tell the audience plainly what documents were found and what remains unverified. Read a baptismal line. Quote a port departure. Show a palace register entry. Then hold the silence in the room and let it mean something. The dramatic part of this story is not the claim that binds two lives together without proof. The dramatic part is the persistence of questions and the human impulse to answer them. That tension between longing for a tidy story and the discipline of records drives curiosity. Invite those who have family archives to look for letters, diaries, or even marginal notes that mention a voyage or a missing relative. Suggest specific places to search. Parish registers in Martinique, notarial records in Bordeaux, and Ottoman palace inventories when available in translation. Give a few concrete links or references in the description so curious viewers can follow up and feel empowered rather than bewildered. Be explicit about the ethics of telling such stories. When lives involve coercion, enslavement, or displacement, emphasize care in language. Avoid turning suffering into spectacle. Show how to narrate compassionately. Name the systems at work, not just a dramatic anomaly. A single anecdote should not eclipse broader injustices. Use the story to teach about colonial economies and imperial networks, not to romanticize them. A trunk with faded label, a ledger with a smudged entry, a tile pattern from an imperial courtyard. Keep faces absent or obscure to respect privacy, and to focus attention on documents and objects. Edit with rhythm. Short lines for revelation, longer sentences for explanation. Pause to let key facts settle. If this mystery gripped you, like this video to help others find it. Share a family disappearance in the comments. One sentence is enough. Vote in the poll. Storm, Corsair Raid, or other. Tell us why below. Subscribe for more cases that pair drama with documents. Save this episode to your Historical Mysteries playlist. Share this with a friend who loves archival hunts. If you want deeper looks, join the newsletter for source lists and document guides. Finally, close on a human note, remind listeners that history is work. Careful, sometimes slow, often frustrating, and always worthwhile. The Amy story matters not because it resolves neatly, but because it opens a window onto systems that shaped many lives. Whether she was lost at sea, taken and moved across oceans, or vanished without trace, the consequences touched real people. Our task is to keep searching, to weigh claims against records, and to tell what we can with honesty and respect. If you have family papers, oral histories, or archival tips, contact us. A single document might change this story's course soon. Thank you for joining this investigation and for treating the past with the care it deserves. I'm Adam. Thank you for listening so far.